In a distant galaxy, amidst a war-torn world, a human man named David found himself stranded on an alien planet. He was no soldier, no hero, just an ordinary man who had ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had once been a simple engineer, but now he was a prisoner, forced to survive in a brutal, unforgiving environment. The alien civilization he had come across was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Ruthless, indifferent, and driven by power. With no way to contact Earth and no means of escape, he had learned to adapt. Life here wasn't just a struggle. It was a daily fight for survival. David wandered through the market district of a vast alien city, keeping his head low and avoiding the gaze of the towering, scaly aliens that roamed the streets. He could feel the eyes of the market vendors on him, sizing him up, sensing his vulnerability. But that day was different. Something caught his attention, drawing his eyes away from the crowded market and toward a stage at the center of the square. There, a crowd had gathered. The familiar sound of alien chatter filled the air, but David's focus was solely on the figure standing on the stage. She was an alien girl, young, with striking features, smooth, metallic skin that shimmered in the sunlight and hair that seemed to defy gravity. Her eyes, though, were what caught David off guard. They were unlike any he had seen before, deep and filled with sorrow. Yet there was something else, something that stirred within him. He couldn't explain it, but it was as if a part of him recognized her, as if he had known her for a long time. She stood there, bound and shackled, her arms stretched wide in a display of helplessness. The crowd cheered, hooting and hollering, as the alien auctioneer spoke of her as though she were no more than livestock. Slave, the auctioneer's voice echoed. Strong, beautiful, obedient, a perfect addition to any home. David's heart pounded in his chest. He had no reason to care, no reason to get involved. He was just a man, barely clinging to life in this hostile world. But something inside him snapped. The girl's gaze met his for just a moment, and it was as if time had frozen. She looked at him with eyes that asked for help, for freedom. For a second, David could see her not as a slave, but as a person, trapped, vulnerable, and desperate. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, David pushed through the crowd. His actions were a blur, but before he knew it, he had reached the stage. The auctioneer looked at him with disdain, but David's hand went to his pocket, where he had kept the last of his savings. Credits he had earned by doing odd jobs around the city. He didn't know why he was doing this. He didn't have enough to pay for much of anything, let alone a slave. But there was something about this girl, something about the way she looked at him, that made him act. "I'll buy her," David said, his voice low but firm. The auctioneer's eyes widened, and the crowd fell silent. You wish to buy this girl?" he asked, clearly surprised. David nodded without hesitation. The auctioneer laughed, clearly not expecting someone to interfere. "You realize what you're doing, human," he sneered. "This is no simple transaction. You're buying a life that is not your own." But David didn't care. He was already mentally preparing himself for the backlash. He had no idea how he would keep her safe. He had no idea how he would survive in this alien world with her by his side. But there was no turning back now. The exchange was made, and just like that, the girl was freed from her shackles. The moment the chains fell to the ground, she didn't look at David with gratitude or relief. No, she looked at him with suspicion, as though she couldn't understand why he had done this. Her eyes were cold, her expression guarded. She took a step back, as if to put distance between herself and him, her body language clearly signaling distrust. The crowd dispersed, but David could feel the eyes of the alien authorities on him. He had just made an enemy of the people in charge of this world. Before David could say anything, the girl turned and spoke in a language he couldn't understand, her voice a mixture of frustration and fear. David didn't know what to say to her. He had no way of explaining himself, no way of communicating the storm of thoughts that had driven him to act. All he knew was that he couldn't just stand by and watch as another innocent life was tossed aside like a worthless object. "I'm not your master," David said softly, though he wasn't sure if she could even understand him. "I just want to help." Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of defiance sparking within them. She shook her head, taking another step back. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, though her tone remained sharp. "Why would you help me? What is it that you want from me?" David paused, unsure of how to answer. He wasn't sure what he expected from this encounter. He didn't even know if helping her was the right thing to do. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew he couldn't just leave her there. He had seen too much suffering in this place, and now it was his turn to do something about it. He had no idea what awaited him, what kind of danger he had just walked into, but one thing was clear: his life had just changed forever. David and the alien girl, whose name he still didn't know, found themselves in the shadow of the city's towering structures. The air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar spices and the hum of distant machinery. The girl kept her distance, walking a few paces ahead of him as they made their way through the narrow alleyways. Despite the space she gave him, there was an unspoken tension between them, like a fragile thread ready to snap at any moment. David glanced at her, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. He didn't know what he had expected when he bought her freedom. A smile of gratitude, a warm gesture of thanks. But the girl hadn't spoken a word since their encounter at the auction. Her gaze was cold, distant, as though she was still trying to process what had just happened. She moved quickly, glancing over her shoulder every few moments, as if waiting for someone to come after them. It was clear that she was on edge. David wasn't sure where to take her next. He had no plans, no idea what he was supposed to do in this alien city. But one thing was certain: he couldn't leave her to fend for herself. As much as he longed to escape, to return to the safety of his small, dingy apartment, he knew that would never happen. The moment he had freed her, he had made himself a target. The alien authorities wouldn't let that pass easily. They had a way of dealing with those who defied their laws. He slowed his pace to match hers, trying to catch her eye. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I just want to help." She stopped abruptly and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable. And for a moment, the silence stretched between them. She didn't speak, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. She was angry, angry at him for interfering in her life, angry at the world that had turned her into a slave, and maybe even angry at herself for allowing it to happen. "You think you can help me?" she finally spoke, her voice sharp, though tinged with something else. Fear, perhaps. "You don't know what it's like to be me. You don't understand what I've been through. You can't just buy your way into someone's life and expect them to trust you." David nodded, his heart sinking. She was right, of course. He didn't understand her pain, didn't know what it was like to be a slave. He couldn't imagine the horrors she had endured, the things that had made her the person she was today. He couldn't expect her to just accept his help without question. "I know," he said softly, "but I'm not asking you to trust me. I couldn't leave you there." The girl's eyes softened for the briefest of moments before hardening again. She looked down at the ground, as if struggling to make sense of what was happening. "You have no idea what you've just done. The authorities will come for you. They won't stop until they've found you. They don't care who you are. They'll kill you just as easily as they'll kill me." David swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had known there would be consequences, but hearing them from her lips made the reality of the situation hit him with full force. He had signed his own death sentence, along with hers, and yet he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. He couldn't stand by and watch as someone else suffered, not again. "Then we run," he said, determination creeping into his voice. "We find a way to escape. We find a place where they can't reach us." The girl shook her head, her long hair swaying with the movement. "You think it's that easy. You can't outrun them. They'll track you. They'll find you no matter where you go." David's gaze flickered to the darkening sky above. The city was alive with motion, but it felt like they were invisible, trapped in a world that didn't care about them. The girl was right. The alien authorities were everywhere, watching, waiting for any opportunity to strike. They wouldn't stop until they had reclaimed what David had taken from them. But there was something in the girl's voice, something in the way she spoke, that told him she didn't believe in escape anymore. She had given up hope long ago. She had resigned herself to a life of servitude, of being nothing more than a tool for others to use. And now, she didn't know how to handle the freedom he had given her. It terrified her. "Where are you from?" David asked quietly, breaking the silence between them. "What's your name?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she glanced around them, her eyes scanning the alleyway as if she expected someone to jump out at any moment. But after a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Kale," she said, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "I'm from a world far away from here, a place you wouldn't understand, a place where freedom was nothing more than a distant dream. I was taken from my home when I was young. My people are nothing but slaves to the authorities." David felt a pang in his chest as he listened to her story, but he didn't know what to say. He couldn't imagine a life like that, forced into servitude from birth, stripped of any sense of identity. He couldn't fathom the pain she had experienced. And yet, in some strange way, he felt a deep connection to her, as if their fates were intertwined. "I didn't ask for this," Kel continued, her voice trembling. "I didn't ask for you to save me. I didn't ask for your pity." David looked at her, his heart aching. "I'm not here out of pity. I'm here because I think we're both trapped. And maybe together, we can find a way out." She didn't respond, but for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a spark of hope, or was it just resignation? He wasn't sure, but it made him want to try harder. To fight for her, to fight for them. "We need to move," she said abruptly, breaking the moment. "We can't stay here. They'll come for us soon." David nodded, his heart racing. The world around them felt like it was closing in, but somehow he felt the weight of their shared struggle bring them closer together. They weren't just two strangers anymore. They were allies, survivors. And for the first time since he had arrived on this alien world, David allowed himself to believe that they might just make it out alive. The night crept in quickly over the alien city, the stars above shining coldly through the cracks in the massive buildings that stretched up toward the sky like jagged teeth. David and Kale moved swiftly through the shadows, staying as close to the alleyways as possible to avoid detection. The girl, though silent and distant, seemed to know the city better than David could have ever imagined. She navigated the labyrinth of streets effortlessly, her every movement precise and deliberate. She was a creature of this world, despite the fact that it had treated her so cruelly. David, on the other hand, felt like an outsider in every sense. His heart raced as they hurried through the narrow streets, every step echoing in the stillness of the night. He kept his eyes on Kale, trying to match her pace, but it wasn't easy. She was faster, more agile, no doubt a result of years spent in this harsh environment. Her eyes darted from one shadow to another, constantly scanning for any signs of danger. He followed her, trusting her instincts more than his own. He had no choice. They didn't speak as they walked. Words, David felt, would only draw attention to them. The silence between them was heavy, but he understood why she kept her distance. She had been through too much to easily trust anyone, especially a human who had just appeared out of nowhere and freed her from the chains that had bound her. He wasn't sure what had possessed him to do it. Maybe it was a moment of reckless compassion, or maybe it was just a gut feeling that she needed help. Whatever it was, he knew now that there was no turning back. They were both in this together, whether she liked it or not. As they neared the edge of the city, Kale stopped suddenly, her posture stiffening. David instinctively halted behind her, his eyes searching for the threat she had sensed. It didn't take long before he heard the faint hum of engines in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. "They're looking for us," Cale whispered, her voice low but urgent. "The authorities. They've already noticed we're gone." David's stomach twisted at the realization. The alien authorities were relentless, their power stretching across the city like a web. Always watching, always waiting. If they were already searching for them, it wouldn't take long before they closed in. The city might have been a maze, but there were no true places to hide. There were no safe spaces for people like him and Cale. No sanctuary where they could disappear. "We need to move," he said quickly, his voice tight with urgency. But Cale shook her head, her eyes narrowing as she listened carefully to the sound of the approaching ships. "No," she replied, her voice steadier than he expected. "Running won't help us now. We need to fight back. We need to find the rebels." David blinked in surprise, his mind racing to catch up with her words. The rebels? He had heard rumors about underground groups fighting against the oppressive regime, but he had never considered joining them. After all, he wasn't a warrior. He was just a man trying to survive. But now, as Cal's words sank in, he realized she was right. Running would only delay the inevitable. If they were going to make it out of this alive, they would need more than just their wits. They would need allies. "Where are they?" he asked, his voice rough with determination. Cal's gaze softened for a brief moment, but she quickly turned back to scan the streets ahead. Her hand gestured toward a narrow passageway between two dilapidated buildings. "Follow me," she instructed, and without waiting for him to respond, she sprinted toward the passage. David hesitated only a second before he followed her, his feet pounding against the ground in time with her swift movements. The alleyway led them into an abandoned part of the city, far from the well-lit, well-patrolled areas. It was a ghost town, the buildings dilapidated and crumbling from years of neglect. They moved quickly, but the deeper they went, the more David's sense of unease grew. The further they ventured into the forgotten part of the city, the more he felt like they were walking into a trap. This wasn't a place anyone would willingly go unless they had no other choice. Eventually, Cale stopped in front of an old, rusted door that barely resembled an entrance anymore. It was hidden beneath layers of grime, with only a faint outline marking where the door once stood. Without a word, Cale pulled something from her pocket, a small glowing device, and pressed it to the door. The metal groaned, and slowly the door creaked open, revealing a dark room beyond. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and old machinery, and David could make out the faint silhouette of people huddled together in the shadows. They were a motley group, mostly aliens, with a few humans scattered among them. There was an air of desperation in the room, but also a quiet sense of purpose. This was the rebel group Cale had spoken of. They were the ones who had fought against the authorities, the ones who had refused to accept the chains of oppression. Cale stepped inside without hesitation, and David followed her, his heart pounding as he entered this hidden world. For the first time since he had arrived on this alien planet, he felt like he might be in the right place. These people, though outnumbered and outmatched, had found a way to resist. They weren't afraid to fight for their freedom. And in that moment, David realized that he had no choice but to join them, no choice but to stand with them against the overwhelming force of the authorities. Cale moved toward a table in the center of the room, where a few of the rebels were gathered, discussing plans in hushed tones. She addressed them with a quiet authority, speaking in their language, a mix of sharp consonants and strange, melodic vowels. David didn't understand the words, but he could hear the urgency in her voice, the determination. These were the people she had been seeking, a group of survivors who were willing to take on the might of an entire regime. The leader of the group, an older alien with pale blue skin and long flowing hair, looked up as Cale approached. He nodded once and then turned his gaze to David, studying him with piercing eyes. There was suspicion in his gaze, but also curiosity. It wasn't every day a human wandered into their hidden base. Cale spoke to him briefly, and David could feel the weight of the conversation, though he understood little. The leader finally nodded, then addressed the others in a series of sharp commands. It was clear that this wasn't a group that trusted easily. Trust, in a place like this, was earned, not freely given. David stood still, taking in the room, feeling like an intruder in this underground world. But Cal's eyes met his, and there was something there, a flicker of hope, perhaps, or a sense of shared purpose. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. Together, they had found something worth fighting for. And for the first time since he had arrived on this alien planet, David understood that the journey ahead would be harder than anything he had ever faced. But it would also be the most important one of his life. David had never been a soldier. He had never dreamed of taking up arms or fighting in wars, especially not on a strange world light years away from everything he had ever known. Yet here he was, sitting in the darkened corner of a rebel hideout, surrounded by a group of people, alien and human alike, who had made it their mission to bring down the same ruthless authorities that had enslaved Cal and countless others. The weight of what he had gotten himself into was beginning to settle heavily on his shoulders. The room hummed with quiet tension. The rebels were busy making their final preparations, their eyes darting between maps and communication devices. Despite the urgency in their movements, a sense of hopelessness lingered in the air. It wasn't the kind of hopelessness that paralyzed. No, these people were fighters, each scar on their bodies a testament to their resilience. But there was an unspoken truth that hung between them all, that they were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. David couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something far bigger than he had imagined. He had no experience in battle, no understanding of the deep political turmoil that had led to this rebellion, yet he had walked into it as though it were some kind of adventure. The truth was, he had been naive, blinded by the hope that they could change things. But in the face of the overwhelming power of the alien authorities, David knew deep down that the cost of this fight would be high, and no one would come out unscathed. Cal, on the other hand, was a different kind of person altogether. She had been hardened by her years of slavery and the subsequent fight for survival. She knew what was at stake, and yet she carried herself with a quiet determination that David envied. As the leader of the rebel group spoke in rapid-fire alien dialect, Cal stood beside him, her posture rigid, her eyes never wavering from the task at hand. David looked at her with a mixture of awe and concern. She had taken the weight of this rebellion on her shoulders long before he had even stepped foot on this planet. She had seen the destruction, the pain, and the violence that these authorities were capable of. It was no surprise that she had pushed David to join them. She knew better than anyone that survival was a matter of action, not inaction. But even though he understood the necessity of it all, David couldn't help but wonder what kind of toll this fight would take on her. At some point during the heated discussion, the leader of the rebels, an older alien with sharp, calculating eyes, turned to David. His gaze was direct, assessing. It wasn't an accusatory look. Instead, it was filled with a strange understanding, as though the leader saw something in David that even David hadn't recognized yet. "You're not one of us," the leader said, his voice low and unassuming, but full of weight. "You don't belong in this fight. You're just a man. But you're here now, and that means something." David didn't respond immediately. The weight of the statement sunk in. He wasn't one of them. He wasn't a seasoned fighter. He wasn't even sure he fully understood what they were fighting for. But in that moment, something clicked for him. He had made a choice when he freed Cal. He hadn't known what that choice meant then, but he understood it now. He couldn't turn back. Not now. Not when he had come this far. "I know I'm not like you," David finally said, his voice steady. "But I'll do whatever it takes. Whatever you need." The leader studied him for a moment longer, as though weighing the sincerity of his words. Then he gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of David's resolve. The planning session continued as Cal and the others mapped out their next moves. There was talk of sabotage, of infiltrating key supply lines, of striking at the heart of the authorities' command center. It was dangerous. It was reckless. But it was the only chance they had. The authorities were tightening their grip on the city, and if they didn't act soon, they would lose everything. David tried to absorb as much as he could, watching Kale with growing respect as she moved seamlessly between the rebels, translating, directing, and contributing to the plans. She was not just a survivor, she was a leader. Her voice carried weight, her decisions sharp and calculated. And though she still kept her distance from David, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of admiration for her strength and resolve. As the rebels prepared to move out, David found himself at a crossroads. He could feel it in his bones, the looming danger, the uncertainty, the fear. He had joined them with the hope that together they could topple an oppressive regime. But now that hope was mingling with the reality of what was about to happen. This wasn't going to be a clean fight. It wasn't going to be easy. And there was a very real possibility that some of them, maybe even Kale, wouldn't make it through. Kale approached him as the group prepared to leave. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes focused on the task ahead. She didn't look scared, but David could see the tension in her shoulders, the faint lines of exhaustion beneath her eyes. She was carrying the weight of this fight on her own, and it was clear that she didn't want to drag anyone else into it. But she had already made her choice, just as he had made his. "Stay close," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "Keep your head down. Do exactly as I say, and you might just make it out of this alive." David nodded, his throat tight. It wasn't much of a promise, but it was the best she could offer. And it was enough. The rebels moved quickly, slipping through the hidden passages of the city. David followed Kale, his heart pounding as they neared their destination. He could feel the tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that only grew stronger the closer they got to their objective. They had to move fast. The authorities were closing in. Every second counted. As they reached the outskirts of the city, David saw the first signs of their target, the massive facility that housed the authorities' central command. It was heavily guarded, surrounded by towering walls and swarming with patrols, a fortress in every sense of the word. But David knew that this was their one shot. They had no choice but to take it. Kale turned to him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that took his breath away. There was no time for words, no time for hesitation. She simply gave a single nod, and without another word, they moved forward, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. David wasn't sure if he was ready for what was to come, but he knew that for Kale, for the rebels, and for the future of this world, he couldn't afford to back down. They were about to step into the unknown, and all they could do was hope that they would come out on the other side. The night was thick with tension as David and Kale, along with the small group of rebels, made their way toward the heart of the authorities' fortress. The oppressive silence weighed on them as they moved through the shadows, their every footstep carefully measured to avoid detection. The moonlight, though dim, illuminated their path, casting long, eerie shadows on the cold, metallic walls of the city. For a brief moment, David could almost feel the weight of every step, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something catastrophic to happen. They were close now, too close. The fortress loomed ahead, an imposing structure made of steel and glass, its towering walls guarded by heavily armed soldiers. The guards patrolled in tight formations, their movements synchronized and precise. It was the kind of place that no one could simply slip into unnoticed. David's heart raced in his chest, the sound of his own breath too loud in his ears. This wasn't like anything he had ever imagined. This was real. And it wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for something much bigger. As the rebels crouched in the shadows, Kale turned to David, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was something in her gaze that made his stomach twist, a mix of resolve and something deeper, something unspoken. For all the bravado she had shown since they had met, David could see the cracks in her armor now. She was as nervous as he was, though she wore her fear like a hidden weapon, buried deep beneath layers of experience and strength. He understood that fear, the kind that came with knowing that nothing was guaranteed, not their survival, not their success, and certainly not their future. "We go in fast," Kale whispered, her voice low and steady. "Once we breach the first perimeter, there's no turning back. Stay close to me. Stick to the plan." David nodded, though the words didn't fully register in his mind. He couldn't think about the plan right now. All he could think about was how quickly everything had escalated, from the moment he had freed her, to joining the rebellion, to standing here now, on the precipice of something that could end in bloodshed. He wasn't sure how much longer his resolve would hold. He wasn't sure how much longer he could pretend to be brave. As the group moved forward, Kale led them with a quiet confidence that David envied. She knew this world, knew its dangers, knew the steps they had to take, but it was impossible to ignore the heavy atmosphere around them. Every breath felt like a countdown. The stakes were too high. If they failed, they wouldn't just die. They would be forgotten, erased from the very fabric of the rebellion they had fought so hard to be a part of. They reached the first set of guards silently. David's heart thudded in his chest as he crouched low, the shadows providing some cover, though not enough to fully conceal them. Cal's hand went to her weapon, a sleek, alien-design blaster that she had carried with her since he had met her. She looked back at him, her eyes urging him to stay still. One of the guards passed within arm's reach, his steps slow, his eyes scanning the darkness. David held his breath, willing himself to be as still as the night itself. The air was thick with anticipation, every second stretching out longer than it should. Then, with a fluid motion, Kale struck. Her weapon flashed with a soft pulse of light, and the guard crumpled to the ground without a sound. David flinched, though the rebels around him moved with practiced precision. They knew what had to be done. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. They moved in quick, coordinated bursts, neutralizing the guards one by one, ensuring no noise would betray them. David's hands were clammy as he followed the others, but he kept his focus, his mind sharp. They'd reached the outer walls of the fortress, the perimeter security system just ahead. David had no idea how Kale knew her way around this place, but she moved with an ease that suggested she had been here before. The rest of the rebels worked quickly, disabling the sensors and cutting through the reinforced barriers. The minutes felt like hours, the tension building in every breath they took. Kale glanced back at him once, her eyes hard with determination, her brow furrowed with concentration. It was impossible to ignore the fleeting glimpse of vulnerability she allowed him to see, just for a second, and only when she thought no one else was looking. Once the perimeter was breached, they slipped inside the fortress, the air growing heavier as they moved deeper into the heart of the building. The halls were sterile, cold, illuminated by harsh, artificial lighting that cast long shadows on the walls. Every corner they turned seemed to echo in the silence, reminding them that they were walking a razor-thin line between life and death. David had expected chaos when they entered, but the stark emptiness of the place unsettled him. It was as if the entire fortress was deserted, its halls empty except for the faint hum of machinery and the occasional flicker of distant lights. The only sound was the soft padding of their footsteps as they moved deeper into the facility. Kale led the way, her eyes scanning every corner, every doorway. She was so focused that she didn't notice David fall behind for a moment, his gaze wandering to the walls of the fortress. He couldn't help it. The sterile, clinical nature of the building felt wrong to him. It felt like something was missing, like something dark and dangerous was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. When they reached the central control room, Kale gestured for everyone to stop. She motioned for David to follow her, and he moved quickly, joining her at the edge of the large door. She pressed a button on her wristpad, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the room was filled with banks of computers, each one humming quietly, processing data, monitoring systems. The rebels moved quickly, taking positions and starting their work. David's eyes locked onto Cull, who was already at the main console, her fingers flying across the holographic interface. She was in her element now, focused and in control. But as David stood there, watching her work, something shifted. A low, menacing sound vibrated through the walls, barely perceptible at first, but growing louder with every passing second. It was the unmistakable sound of alarms. "We're out of time," Cale said, her voice urgent. "They know we're here. Get to the exit. Now." Before anyone could react, the doors slammed shut with a resounding clang, sealing them inside. Panic spread through the rebels like wildfire as the alarms blared louder, filling the room with a sense of impending doom. Cal's eyes met David's, and for the first time, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Fear. Not fear for herself, but fear for the people around her, for the people she had led into this fight. David's chest tightened. The exit was no longer an option. Their only choice was to fight their way out, and that was a gamble none of them were ready to take. As the sound of boots echoed outside, David realized just how real this fight had become. They had crossed the point of no return. There would be no walking away now. The rebellion had started with a single act of defiance, but it would end with a fight for survival. And in that moment, David realized that everything, every decision, every choice, had led them here, to this one final battle. The silence that followed the alarms was the kind of silence that suffocated. The walls of the control room seemed to close in around them as the rebel group stood frozen, their breaths shallow and rapid. The only sound was the sharp mechanical hum of the fortress, a sound that felt like the pulse of the building itself, now fully aware that they were inside. David's hands clenched at his sides, his heart hammering in his chest as Kel turned to face him, her eyes dark with a mixture of fear and determination. "They're coming," she said softly, though her voice was steady. It was a fact, not a question, and the urgency in her tone hit David like a slap across the face. The rebels, too, were starting to move, gathering their weapons and preparing for what was undoubtedly going to be a fight to the death. Their plan had been to strike fast, disable the systems, and get out before the authorities could respond. But now, it was clear that the element of surprise had been shattered. David had expected chaos when they first entered the fortress. But this was something else. They were trapped in a maze of steel and glass, and every door, every corridor, seemed to lead them deeper into danger. The weight of it all was starting to crush him. He wasn't a fighter. He had never been one. And yet, here he was, standing among a group of people who had been fighting this war for far longer than he had, each of them hardened by years of resistance. They had all lost something, maybe everything, to this war, and now they were counting on him to pull through. Cale didn't wait for David to process the gravity of the situation. She moved with the fluidity of someone who had seen countless battles, someone who had long since stopped flinching when the stakes were raised. She motioned for David to follow her, and without a word he did. They moved in tandem, as though they had done this 1,000 times before. The rebels had split into two groups. One would continue to disable the core systems, buying them precious minutes of time. The other, which David found himself in, was tasked with finding an escape route. The latter, as Kel had quietly pointed out, was going to be the harder part of the mission. They had breached the perimeter, but now they were inside the heart of the fortress, and if they didn't move quickly, they would be surrounded. David could feel the tension in the air as he followed Cale down a narrow corridor, his footsteps echoing loudly in the quiet of the fortress. It felt like the walls were pressing in on him, the weight of the decision to come crashing down on his shoulders. What if they couldn't escape? What if the rebellion had made a fatal mistake? Cale glanced at him, reading his expression, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. She didn't say anything, but her eyes softened just enough for him to catch it. A flicker of something human, something he hadn't seen in her before. She was terrified too. She had to be. This was her rebellion, her fight. But in that brief moment, he saw that she was just as vulnerable as he was. They reached a small service hatch, hidden in plain sight behind a set of maintenance panels. Cale quickly pulled it open, revealing a dark, cramped tunnel that stretched into the darkness. It was their escape route, their lifeline. David's chest tightened as he glanced down the narrow passage. It was small, claustrophobic, and probably crawling with more security systems. But it was their only shot. "Get in," Cale urged, pushing him gently toward the entrance. David hesitated. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. There were 1,000 things that could go wrong. The rebels might not make it out. They could get caught. They could die here. But as Cale gave him one last, steady look, he realized that he had no choice. He didn't want to die in this cold, sterile place. He didn't want Cale and the others to die either. He stepped into the tunnel, the walls pressing in on him as the darkness consumed everything around him. The air was thick, musty with the scent of old wiring and grease. It felt wrong, unnatural. But Cale moved ahead, her figure barely visible in the dim light. They had to move. Fast. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing at times until it felt like they were crawling more than walking. David's muscles ached from the effort, but he forced himself to keep moving. Cale led them forward with the same quiet resolve, her every step measured, her focus unwavering. She didn't stop, didn't falter. She was a leader in every sense of the word. The passageways seemed to go on forever, each bend in the tunnel only revealing more darkness ahead. Sweat trickled down David's neck, his breathing becoming erratic as the air grew thick with tension. They had no idea how long they had before the authorities found them. He could almost hear the footsteps of soldiers closing in, could almost feel the heat of their breath on his neck. At last, Cale stopped abruptly, her hand raised in a signal for everyone to halt. The rebels behind her froze as well, and David felt the weight of her decision settle over him like a dark cloud. Something was wrong. He could sense it in the way she moved, the way she tensed when she heard a sound in the distance. "I don't think we're alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the air vents and machinery. The others nodded, their weapons ready. David strained his ears, trying to hear what Cale had heard. It was faint at first, but then it became clear, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, muffled by the walls, but getting closer. The authorities had found their trail. Cale didn't hesitate. She pushed forward, motioning for the others to follow her as she moved quickly down the remaining length of the tunnel. They could still make it. There had to be a way out. As they neared the end of the tunnel, a sudden burst of noise shattered the stillness, a loud, echoing crash as the metal hatch at the end of the passageway exploded open. Soldiers in black uniforms poured into the tunnel, weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. David's heart skipped a beat. They were trapped. There was no way out. But Cale didn't panic. She didn't even flinch. She raised her weapon, her fingers pulling the trigger in a smooth, practiced motion. The first soldier went down in a single shot, and then another and another. The rebels reacted in kind, firing with precision, their faces grim but determined. David's hands trembled as he reached for his own weapon, but it was already too late. The battle had begun. Everything moved in a blur after that. The sound of gunfire echoed through the narrow tunnel, filling the space with a chaotic symphony of violence. David fired without thinking, his aim shaky, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. Cale shouted orders, guiding the group as they fought their way through the oncoming soldiers, each move deliberate, each decision crucial. It was a dance of survival, and David was in the middle of it, following Cale's lead, trusting her to get them through. But even as they fought, David could feel the weight of the situation sinking in. They weren't going to make it out without losses. They weren't going to walk away from this unscathed. The authorities were too powerful, and they were too few. Yet, as the gunfire began to subside, as the dust settled, and the last of the soldiers fell, Cale turned to him, her face bloody but unbroken. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, David saw something new, a flicker of hope. They weren't dead yet, and that was enough to keep fighting. The air in the tunnel grew thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and the low hum of dying electronics. The faint echoes of gunfire still lingered in David's ears, a reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded around them. His heart was pounding in his chest, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps as he tried to process what had just happened. The sounds of battle had faded, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. The rebels, battered but alive, stood in the aftermath of their victory. The fallen soldiers lay scattered around them, their weapons discarded and their bodies slumped against the walls. David's mind was still reeling from the explosion of violence, but there was no time to dwell on it. There was no time for fear. Kale was already moving, her eyes scanning the darkened tunnel ahead, her face a mask of determination and resolve. David felt his legs ache as he stood, trying to steady himself against the weight of everything that had happened. He wasn't sure how long they had been underground, how long they had fought their way through the fortress. It felt like hours, maybe days. Time had become irrelevant in the face of survival. All that mattered now was getting out, finding a way to escape before the authorities regrouped and sent reinforcements. They couldn't afford to stay here any longer. Kale turned to him, her face grim but resolute. "We're not out yet," she said, her voice steady despite the blood and dirt that stained her skin. "Keep moving." David nodded, his mind still clouded by the sheer intensity of the battle. He could barely comprehend the fact that they had made it this far. The rebellion had been a desperate, reckless gamble from the start, and yet here they were, still alive, still fighting. It was a strange, terrifying feeling, but it also filled him with something else. A sense of purpose, perhaps, or maybe just the will to survive. They moved quickly, the small group of rebels sticking close to one another as they navigated the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the fortress. David could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him, a constant reminder that they weren't safe yet. Every turn, every step, felt like a potential death sentence. But they couldn't stop. They had come too far, and they couldn't let it end here. As they neared the exit, the distant sound of voices reached their ears, urgent, panicked voices, growing louder with each passing second. The authorities were coming. They were getting closer. It was only a matter of time before they would be surrounded. "We have to move," Kale said again, her voice tinged with a new urgency. Now. David's heart raced as they quickened their pace, their footsteps echoing through the tunnel. The hatch that led to the surface was just ahead, its metal doors standing between them and freedom. But it was a fragile hope. He could almost hear the footsteps of the soldiers behind them, closing in, preparing to strike. Kale reached the door first, her fingers working the control panel with practiced precision. The seconds felt like minutes as the door hissed open, revealing a narrow shaft that led upward into the unknown. The light from the surface filtered down, casting a faint glow that seemed impossibly far away. "Get in," Kale ordered, urgency in her voice. She was already moving, her hand outstretched to help the rebels climb into the shaft one by one. David followed close behind, his heart pounding louder now, his every instinct screaming at him to get out, to escape. But even as he climbed, he couldn't shake the nagging thought at the back of his mind. The fear that this wasn't over, that the worst was yet to come. When David reached the top of the shaft, he was greeted by the harsh, blinding light of the outside world. It was a stark contrast to the darkness they had just escaped, and for a moment, he could hardly believe it. They had made it. They had escaped. The fortress was behind them, and the city stretched out before them, silent, abandoned, but still standing. Kale was already on the surface, her eyes scanning the horizon, her body tense with anticipation. David followed her, stepping into the open air for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze against his face, but there was no time to savor the relief. They had escaped, but they weren't free yet. "Where now?" David asked, his voice hoarse from the tension, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Cale didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, as if weighing her next words carefully. Finally, she spoke. "We're not done yet," she said softly. "The authorities will come for us. They'll never stop, but we have a chance now. We've hit them where it hurts, and we're not alone. There are more like us, more rebels who will keep fighting. As long as we keep moving, as long as we keep fighting, we can still win." David swallowed hard, her words settling over him like a weight. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that there was hope, that the fight they had started was worth it. But the reality of the situation was sinking in. They had survived, yes, but the rebellion wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger, something that would take everything they had. The rebels gathered around them, their expressions grim but determined. They were bruised, bloodied, exhausted, but they were still standing. And that, David realized, was what mattered. They were still fighting. "We need to keep moving," Cale said again, her voice firm. "The authorities won't rest until they've hunted us down, but we're not going to give them that satisfaction." David nodded, though his mind was still spinning. He had never signed up for any of this. He had never expected to be part of a rebellion, fighting against a powerful, oppressive regime. He had been dragged into it by circumstance, by his desire to help Cale, by the hope that there could be something better. But now, as he looked around at the small group of rebels standing with him, he realized that they were all in this together. They had made it this far. They had survived. And that was more than enough to keep fighting. Cale turned to face the horizon, her eyes scanning the road ahead. There was no going back now. The war was far from over, but as long as they had breath in their bodies, they would keep fighting. They would fight for freedom, for survival, for the future. And for the first time since he had arrived on this alien world, David allowed himself to believe that they might just succeed. That together, they could change everything. It wasn't the end, but it was a beginning. And that was all they needed.